up, YouTube and social media land? This is the K-Series Identification and Compatibility Guide that I put together for the EM2 ES2 community when I wrote the EM2 swap guide for K-Series. This is just a compilation of engines, heads, intake manifolds, and a light overview of transmissions, along with shifter cables and other small components. So that way you can visually compare and understand the slight differences between the used parts markets and what you may find and what you may want and need. There is a little bit of information in here, but mostly it's a visual representation. I will elaborate more in this video than what's actually in the guide. I may put this in later and update it, but it's highly unlikely that I'll do that. There may be some small changes over the next few years as I accumulate more parts. I didn't address a few major components like water pumps, aftermarket components to make it work, like alternator relocations, or especially aftermarket intake manifolds. So the guide is really straightforward with the way it is put together. It's laid out with a table of contents. I did address some of the newer generation of motors that may or may not be indirectly compatible, but are actually a completely different engine design. The head information is just pictograms that show all four views of the head, and it helps with identifying what and where all the information is for what can be purchased, especially in the used parts market. That's really what this is geared to, again, is the used parts market, and identifying, even to the newest Honda members, identifying those components. That's why this was assembled, put together. The constant question of, what do I need to make this intake manifold run on this engine? What do I need for a header? How am I going to go about taking the OEM stuff that I have? What do I need to change to make it work to go into X chassis? And this at least identifies what's available. The exhaust manifolds is just a quick overview of, I think, 4 or 5 of the most common ones you'll run across for the major engines that are more sought after, or at least more readily available as well. Transmission and identification and comparison is, it just lays out what you're looking at on a transmission. It actually has a difference between the very early K-Series and the later, more compatible K-Series as far as transmission-wise. It also goes into shift cables as well. I will elaborate a little bit, especially on each specific engine type or section, again, to share a little bit more information. But hopefully this will be useful to someone, and it'll help them work through purchasing used parts from another member of the Honda community. Take your pick of junkyards or even online sales like eBay. So the overview is really just a broad idea of how I put this together, what it's really used for. Again, Super Street, I use Super Street and Hybrid Racing's K20 and K24 respectively guides to help assemble this. It was a great structure and resource to start with, and then I added and picked through specific components and information that I felt was necessary. The guide is just a visual representation for the moment. There are some very neat specifics in there, but the overviews, again, is to share and really discern and help you decide a little bit on what direction you're looking to go as far as the used parts market, importers, or even if you need to buy OEM components from a dealership. The first one is the K20A. Now, all Japanese market engines that are 2-liter motors and the earlier generation of K series will be labeled K20A. That gets a little bit irritating when you find the lower trim models of the engine labeled K20A and then the Type R variant labeled K20A. To find a Type R in the US is fairly pricey. Whether it's K series, whether it's B series, whether it's even once you get into the Euro R H series and F20Bs, and it becomes muddled because you're looking at a K20A, and all K20As look very, very similar. But listed here are the models they came in. We didn't get the Civic Type R in 2001 to 2005. We got a D17, and we got an EP3, which is the hatchback. The DC5 was completely out. We only got the K20A3, similar to the EP3, but much different, and the K20A2 in the DC5 here. Later models, it was more comparable once you get into the 8th gen Civics from 2006 to 2011. 2012 and up, it's more streamlined across the board even more. But the Type R is the premium of premium. And identifying them comes with a piston intake manifold. It comes with identifying the transmission if it has one. I'm sure there are resources out there for serial numbers, but unfortunately I haven't provided them here. The market outside of the US for the Type R is huge. Unfortunately, we're just not a driver's market. So picking a Type R has to come from an importer pretty much. The only chance to get a Type R is going down to the used market, which becomes, again, even more finicky with picking out parts, knowing what people have changed, understanding what you're looking at and what you're looking for. I need to do more research on the front of piston combinations, cam combinations. I didn't include camshafts on this for a reason, because I just did not have the resources to get them in here and get good, accurate information for everything. So I could not do that. Something to note, the Type R is a $5,500 swap, sometimes all the way down to a $3,500 swap. Your typical K20 A2 or variant out of the RSX Type S is about $2,000 right now. And this is as of March 2021. These command OEM power for a reason. They are a beautiful package. They rev, they're well balanced, they work well, especially if you have a Type R ECU to power it from an OEM level. It just works flawlessly on the street. Again, we did not get this variant with the transmissions, the housings. There is no difference between US and Japanese market, US and Euro market for the 2001 to 2005, or the 2001 to 2006 Integra. The Accord Euro and the Civic Type R Euro that are listed for the later dates, there's a slight mount configuration difference, and you will need to talk with your aftermarket mount provider to getting mounts into your pick of Civic or Accord. Next one's just pictorials. It just shows you the bay and the OEM configuration. That's it. K20A2 is the USDM DC5, so RSX, from 02 to 04. You'll notice slight compression variances. You'll note it from the Type R. You'll also see power steering and pretty much all of the US market. The intake manifold is the most common K-series manifold that most people would shift to get away from any plastic two-piece design, space constraints. It's a PRB manifold that just works well. It flows well. Not the best, but it does flow. Other than that, this swap, the harness, the ECU, the engine, a lot of this comes out and goes into your Civic or Accord. It's a one-piece harness design that runs all the way back to the computer. And it just has a small pigtail and another ECU connector that runs to the rest of the chassis to give you cluster signal, to give you power to your computer, to have your check engine light work, to have your service connector work for your OBD2 reader. But this helps with that a little as far as what packages come from where. In 2005-2006, they did we'll call it a mid-model facelift update. And what happened was they changed the computer a great deal. Plugs are still the same, but the ECU pinout's different. And while you can take a K20Z1 from a 2005-2006 and drop it straight into a K20A2, and it's plug and play as far as putting a K20A2 engine harness on top of it, the differences lie in the high frequency speed sensor. The pinout has been updated to reflect a more modular use of where the connectors are for some of those sensors that they've been upgraded to, or updated to, not necessarily an upgrade. The primary goal for them was to move towards what later became, I guess, a universal understanding and idea of computers and mounting in the engine bay for the 2006 and newer year models for the Honda Civic. And so this was kind of rolled in with that, but it still uses the one-piece harness design. It nearly mimics the complete layout of the 0204 RSX. The mounts are still the same as the 0204 RSX. The intake manifold and head are identical to the RSX. The biggest change was internally, and it was just to improve a little bit of airflow, improve a little bit of just overall driving performance. Other than that, completely interchangeable. If you were to use a 0506 engine harness, you'd need an 0506 ECU or a jumper harness, and then you'd have to have there's an update for the aftermarket ECUs that handles the speed sensor and the high frequency side. And I'll say high frequency and low frequency readily. All it is how many pulses per mile it puts out. One's on the countershaft, one's on the back of the transmission that runs directly off the ring gear. I'll address that in the transmission area. This was again, one of the early K-series, and they made that change across the board. The K20Z3, a lot of people will notice, comes out of the 8th gen, and they chase after these intake manifolds. They are probably one of the better flowing, readily available OEM manifolds in the U.S. market. And the motors themselves they work great. They perform great. You don't have to deal with power steering brackets. They already have an idler pulley on them. The car comes with EPS from the factory. The components that really help this thrive are the drive-by-wire, just for drivability's sake. It really just helps the engine perform on an OEM level. Drivability works great. The conversion to get it into any chassis older with a throttle cable. It's just pulling the OEM throttle body off, putting an adapter on, and putting an 02 to 04 throttle body, or 02 to 05 throttle body on there, so you can get running in your car. The best part is that very little's changed wiring wise. You can still interchange these harnesses pretty readily. It's just getting the computer to cooperate as far as the harness going on the engine, not the harness going into the chassis. They did some wonderful stuff with some extra mounts, getting the torsion mounts to work, just getting the power to the ground, getting it a little bit more rigid, but still maintaining the factory drivability. But again, the components are improving more and more aggressive camshafts, better power, better torque. Okay, so we're stepping into we'll call it the economy world a little bit, and this is where, if you were to interact with me in the forum setting or the Facebook group setting, I would tell you that if you're willing to put a K20A3 in there and just economically drive the car, it would last you and suit you well. There are plenty of EP3s and base RSXs out there to prove this. It's a much lower compression. You can put regular pump gas in it. It's nothing to speak about, but it does get great gas mileage, and they do last. The difference between the Civic hatchback, the EP3, and the RSX base is the intake manifold that drives it. So you'll notice that the EP3 has the intake manifold off of the RSX Type S. It does help with a consistent power curve. The computer itself has no real change other than the IV tech that really helps it work well. It doesn't have the traditional intake and exhaust VTEC either, so you don't get the great power gains, but you don't have much compression to take advantage of with the economy version of this. The engines themselves and everything that bolts onto them is almost identical to the Type S RSX. If you were to interchange a mount, same. If you were to interchange an intake manifold between an RSX Type S and EP3 hatch, same. You would have minimal issue finding performance parts for these. You would have only wiring difference of the intake manifold on the RSX base. If you notice, it's got the long black plastic runners, and what it has is IEBs in there to direct flow, and it may not be labeled IEBs. It's a term used from the B series GSR and H22 realm. But what it does is it redirects flow and creates a longer runner, so it creates a better torque curve. RSX is a little bit heavier, so respectively it's going to need that extra little bit of torque. The take from this is parts are readily available. The bases are out there. The manual transmissions are readily available. Again, if you had manual harness, it would be plug and play for any of your swap, and it could go onto your Type S. It could go onto your bigger K-Series motors that similarly have everything that you need to drop it into your choice of platform. So between these and a Type R, notating which one's which. Well, the pistons, lower compression, you'd notice that. You'd be extremely low on power. You would notice the RSX variant of the manifold very quickly. It would be very, very evident that this would not be a Type R. So when getting a K20A, that's an EP3 variant or a RSX base variant. This should help with identifying that a little bit, and I'll break down the heads and the intake manifolds later on in this guide. The K24s are amazing. They come in the Elements, they come in the CRVs, they come in the Accords, and the TSXs. The K24A1 is, we're going to refer to it as an economy motor because it only has the intake VTEC. It operates fairly similar to the EP3 and the RSX base. So it can operate on the 12 of the 16 valves, so it can cut valve off and give you better economy, make it work better. And the best part is that if you pull this head off and put a better head on it, you can accomplish quite a lot power-wise. This is, again, geared towards Civics 88 and newer, Accords 90 and newer, to get a better motor, a better package under the hood. The 2.4 liters are a great way to go, and Hybrid Racing's guide was really geared towards putting a Type S head or a Civic Si head on these engines to get them to really perform. The overall availability of these engines, great deal. CRVs, Elements, again, this one specifically comes out of the CRV, and it's there for 4 years. And it's just an all-round great package. Unfortunately, with a swap like this, you would still have to source a 2002 to 2005 Civic Si hatchback engine harness, or 2002 to 2006 RSX engine harness and ECU that match it respectively due to the break in 02 to 04 RSX and 05 06 RSX. And it plugs right in. The only difference is the cam sensor, or the crank sensor that's down by the crankshaft pulley. And it would bolt in. There's a slight difference in mounts because the engine is taller, has higher deck height, and it will bolt to pretty much, it will bolt to any transmission all the way up through, I think 2015, 2014 for the K-Series. So they never changed or revised the bell housing pattern. But there are variances in the transmission mount pattern throughout the years. K24A2 is probably the most premium of the premium. It comes out of the TSX. Now, 0405, it had a mid-year shift. And there was an update to camshafts, and there was an update to the intake manifold that enabled better drivability. And you'll see a lot where I'll use the term RBC adapter plate for the intake manifold. And what that enables you to do is put a throttle cable driven throttle body from an RSX or aftermarket application that uses the same bolt pattern as RSX onto these intake manifolds. And it's an RBC adapter plate. This is an RBB labeled head and an RBB labeled intake manifold. Even between that mid-year shift from 04 to 05 up to 06 to 08, the only variance is how it handled the IACV. So in 04-05, it uses a traditional IACV that flows coolant, it warms everything up, and then the IACV would electronically allow air to come through to bypass the throttle body to keep the engine idle. In 06 to 08, the drive-by-wire worked a little bit better. It uses the drive-by-wire to maintain idle and ignition timing. Instead of bypassing the throttle body, it actually utilized the computer to maintain idle. The 06 to 08 plenums on the intake manifolds flow a lot better. The cams are better in 06 to 08. They are more sought after. They are directly interchangeable with the 2006 to 2011 8-Gen Civic SI cams. high performance, too low VTEC on intake and exhaust. It was just a great performing motor and capable of quite a bit out of the box. The PRB head from the K20A2 out of the RSX does flow better. It does work better, but this package builds a great deal of torque. So if you have a little bit heavier car, or you just want something that's a little bit more fun daily driving, I dropped mine in stock. I have a 2001 Honda Civic, dropped it in, have had minimal issues. I dropped a set of dropping cams in it to get the most out of the engine for what it was, and it's worked great. The parts market for this is, again, readily available. It comes out of TSX. That is the Honda Accord premium version from Acura, and it's a great package. This is the K20A2 and the K24A2 are the two engines that everybody kind of gravitates towards for performance, just to get a fun drivability out of them. But you notice that it has power steering in the U.S. There's some that you get outside of the U.S. that do not, but you'll need an idler pulley in there to get rid of that, unless you're planning on keeping it for whichever chassis you're going into. And that's about the only change you'll have to make. K24A4. This is the element, and the only really unique thing about this is it's got a slimmer intake manifold labeled RAA. It gets great economy. It flows extremely fast. The ports are a little bit smaller, flowing through. The chambers are a little bit smaller, just to get a really high velocity, good air-fuel mixture. The best part about this is, for the swap community, it comes with a throttle cable-driven throttle body from day one. I'm not sure on the bolt pattern. This is something I didn't really address. It may be an RBC variant. It may be a PRB variant. I'm not sure. I haven't had my hands on one. It has the same functionality as a K24A1, 12 valve operated for economy. And it comes with a 5-speed and an all-wheel drive variant as that. But no limited slip from the factory, just the all-wheel drive potential. There was one motor between the K24A1 and A4. There was one where the valves would hit if you were to put a VTEC head on, whether it be an RBB or PRB or a RBC head. It would contact, and I'm not sure which one, unfortunately. So there's a big disclaimer in there that you've got a little bit more research to do. This is strictly for identifying the engines. Now you'll notice this says the RAA intake manifold has a resonator box on the lower portion of the intake made of plastic. It's actually tucked in this area right here. So you'll notice that right away. When comparing it to the K24A2, it's still a two-piece intake manifold design. So it has a upper where your injectors are located, and then a lower where your throttle eye is mounted to, and then a gasket in between them and bolted together. The K24A8. It's, again, the economy version. 2 low VTEC on the intake, 1 low VTEC on the exhaust. Here we go. The K20, same as the K24A4 engines. The only difference is the pistons will contact the K20 cylinder head. So that's the disclaimer that was resonating in my mind, and I had to kind of notate it. The K20Z1, or sorry, K24Z1, you're not going to see much more difference in the larger SUVs. They have great torque numbers. They have great economy. You'll be able to bolt the swap in, and it may be the cheapest of the variants just because it's not chased after for the performance aspect. This is where you begin to shift from the older A series. So the first generation of K series are the K20s and K24As. The K20 and K24Zs, other than the K20Z1, there's a slight update, and they may not drain coolant as well. They may not drain oil as well. If you were to take a K20A performance cylinder head, like the K20A2 or K24A2, and bolt it onto a K24Z engine. This outlines an issue with the block-off plates for this one specifically. This motor has the oil filter in a different location. Normally, your K series will have your oil filter right here. This has it on the lower side. It was to avoid interference with an intermediate shaft update too, and this walks you through a little bit of what's required if you do manage to get one of these from the junkyard. Now, it may not even hurt just to leave that there, but if you update the oil pump, you update a couple other ideas with the aftermarket goodies that are available, you may want to consider this, but the research still has to be done to see if it's necessary. The K24Z7, I'll label this the last of the traditional K series. This came in the Honda Civic Si and the Acura ILX. Make great power. I went and did a pre-buy on this 4 years ago maybe, and I was thrilled with how well it worked. It's even in a larger four-door chassis, it works great. Power's there all the way through. It doesn't come with power steering. It has EPS already built into it, just like the previous generation of Honda Civic SIs. The update to this chassis, the plastic intake manifolds, I frown upon. I don't like plastic. I never have, never will. There's not much more you can do with it other than remold it. Put something better on. It still works well out of the box. The exhaust did get an update. So the V6 variant in 2004, the J series got an update to where it had an integrated exhaust manifold. So instead of 3 headers coming out on each side of the V6, it has 1 header coming out each side with a 4-bolt flange. And assembly-wise, it's really easy to change over. It's 4 bolts. There's 4 nuts that the flange comes right off, and you can upgrade your exhaust. The downfall is the performance arena when it comes to putting and polishing, to making really good power out of the box. The only benefit is if you're going to turbo this motor and keep a factory-style setup. It's a single pipe that runs over and mounts up. This is the next generation, and that's why I said that the K24 Z7 was the last of the traditional K series. This is the K24W and K24V. This is a direct injected engine. Now, this is just for reference. I'm not sure about interchangeability, compatibility, even if a transmission may or may not bolt up. It outlines it here, but this is just to show you what you may or may not want to purchase. This has an injector pump over here, and fuel comes in, it ramps up pressure, and then it sprays it at that high pressure. The intake manifold atomizes really well. This is very unique in what it is because of the intake chambers. So you'll notice, you should notice this right away. The traditional size and shape is no longer there. This is in case someone tries to identify this engine to see if it's compatible. That's all this is in there for. For all intents and purposes, it's not interchangeable. This is the integrated exhaust manifold similar to the K24Z7. Slight update to that. And now we're to the head information. So I went through, outlined some of the best flowing heads and their application, how they go about them in this short one, but it all comes down to where they perform. So I didn't include the cams for a reason. The lack of information in identifying OEM cams is nearly non-existent. There's some that you get into the Type Rs, the Type S's, and the TSX K24A2 variants. So this was a study done by a shop, I believe, in Texas, and they flowed each of these heads. And you'll notice the PPA head is at the very top, but not one of the performance heads that's really utilized in building a performance-driven swapped car. And the reason being, the potential to build more power outside the OEM realm isn't there. The support isn't there. The VTEC is not there. It flows great, but again, the airflow is very fast and atomizes fuel for economy. Whereas the PRB and the RBB, they're more geared to the higher RPMs, and that's where they perform. So, this is where you get into the interchangeability of intake manifolds and heads. So, the top picture is showing a PRB intake manifold off of an 02 to 06 RSX or 02 to 05 EP3 Honda Civic Si. And it's showing it bolted to a K24A2 flange or a K20 Z3 flange or a flange or a head that is a integrated coolant passage built into the intake manifold. And you have a small adapter that's needed to get this to work and have the water net come out the front. This RBC to PRB throttle body adapter is the RBC adapter that's outlined. It is what's necessary to get a throttle cable driven throttle body on all of the other intake manifolds that can be utilized and come on the OEM applications. And then the RSX uses a map sensor on the throttle body. The other intake manifolds use the map sensor on the intake manifold itself. Okay, so this is outlined for just a visual representation and actual representation, actual pictures of each of the heads. Some of them have cams installed and some of them do not. I wasn't consistent on which ones had which. It actually took me a few years to get all the pictures compiled and find good pictures of where they were taken. A lot of them mix between the OEM aftermarket support areas where they refurbish heads, and then another portion from eBay, of course. So I outlined the VTEC solenoid ports, the exhaust ports along with where the head coat is located there, the intake ports and where the head coat is located there, the time cover side of the head that also, they put a head coat on every side of this engine, including the bottom. There's where the mating surface is, the head coat is located there as well. But each of these is just a representation of each of the individual cylinder heads, so you can understand what you're purchasing. If you were to set a K20A2 and a PPA CRV K24A1 head side by side, you would have an issue with a newcomer identifying the differences and what they're really looking for. So this is a single load VTEC that you'll see outlined in the engine section, and it has one intake and one exhaust primary, and then the VTEC has only the VTEC on the intake side, and then the iVTEC's located in the cam angle inside the cam gear. but this is where the cylinder head code is on the bottom of the engine. And again, these are just compilations of really clean heads, pictures that were available online, going through verifying what they were, being able to double check the pictures and what you really see and what you should get when it comes to buying used parts from other individuals. PRB head here. This is probably, we'll call it the sought after. It's one of the premium that you can get to flow great, makes great compression, all around dual VTEC, and it is, again, sought after. RBB head from the TSX, probably a great second to the PRB head that comes on the RSX. This comes out of the TSX. RBC head from the 06 or to 11 Honda Civic SI. The intake manifold section is great. I outline what you need to get it working on any variant of motor, whether it will work properly, work well. I didn't really address the aftermarket intake manifolds, and I didn't address the fuel rail variants. So I'll try and sneak that in there, but there's no guarantee. Here there is the two-part design. So the upper intake and the lower intake. Upper intake will have the injector, lower intake will have the throttle body if it's a two-piece design. The integrated coolant passages that I've addressed in a previous section. The difference in the throttle bodies, again, for an older vehicle that has a throttle cable, to get that to work properly on the engine. PRB and PRC are nearly identical. The PRB comes in the USDM RSX, and the PRC comes on the ITR variant from 01 to 05. The throttle body off of these vehicles using this bolt pattern will be the one OEM component that will be used on the other manifolds to get them to work in your 2000 Honda Civic, your 1995 Honda Accord, your take a pick of anything with throttle cable on it still. You'll notice that there are two generations of the PRB, and this is that RSX 2002 to 2004 0506 split. There may be no variance visually from the intake manifolds themselves. The diameter is a little bit bigger for the opening of the throttle body, and I'm not sure if this has an update to the IACV port, but again, readily interchangeable, easily interchanged with no issues. The RBB has another split, another generation split between them. This comes in the TSX. It's from 2002 to 2008, and 2004 to 2008. With that, 04-05 was the first year. It still used the traditional IACD on the throttle body, and 06-08 used a drive-by-wire throttle body that included the IACD kind of built into the programming and how the car operated, and it would manipulate the throttle body to control idle. You'll notice a larger intake plenum diameter on the 06-08, and both of them have the map sensors on the intake manifold. You will need an RBC throttle body adapter to make this work with a traditional throttle cable driven throttle body. The RBC manifold comes off of the 8th gen Civic SI. So 06 to 11, it flows great, works well, integrated coolant passage. This is the RBC manifold that the RBC adapter plate's kind of geared towards. it really just it's a great high RPM variant that flows amazing. But again, integrated coolant port, a lot of people chop off to go onto the RSX, and then they'll use the RSX coolant port that is not integrated. Other than that, this bolts to pretty much every other variant of the engine with no issue. RRC is the Type R variant of the RBC. A little bit update to the rigidity, the chamber, the passages for air are just larger. It flows better, but a little less common in the States. But integrated coolant port, integrated coolant passage, and again, the RBC adapter will be necessary to use this. The RSP intake manifold off the Euro Accord R. You'll notice a huge plenum on this, two-piece design that has to be unbolted. It's got runners on it to build great torque. It performs similar to the 06 to 08 RBB, and especially with the intake manifold design length runners, but still a one-piece design with the integrated coolant passage, and still requires the RBC adapter to get a throttle cable driven throttle body on it. The economy versions. These are the ones that you'll see. So on the Element, I outlined this chamber right here that flows into a resonance chamber or resonator chamber that helps increase plenum volume when you get on the gas a little bit more and you just need that demand of air. Unfortunately, without dropping the intake manifold pressure too much. These are geared towards economy. If you see these or if you notice these, this is a great giveaway to it not being a K24A2 manifold. So it requires the RBC adapter plate to use them. There's no real world performance gains over purchasing this versus an RBB and two-piece manifold, unfortunately. And I'm not sure about the compatibility between the lower and the upper intake manifolds if you were to mix them. I haven't really addressed it. And again, if you have this on your Element and that's the motor that's going into your Civic or Accord, you understand why it's not really geared towards performance. It's more geared towards economy. This is the plastic manifold from the K20A3 in the RSX base. This thing is, call it a monstrosity, because it has these long ports, these long runners to really build the torque in that motor. The RSX is just a little bit heavier, a good heavier than the EP3. So it suffered a little bit with a high flowing manifold without the power there. So it could manipulate the runner length based on RPM load, build better torque in different ranges, and it worked well. This is the kind of the downfall to the base world is plastic manifolds. They later adapted this for the R40 manifolds on the K24 Z7s, pretty much across the board. And I also used that on a couple of the Accord variants as well. This is the R40 manifold I was talking about. This is a plastic design. And it uses an integrated coolant passage metal base. Injectors are mounted there. The R40 intake manifold came on variances of the engines from 08 to 15. And it helped with torque numbers immensely. You could accomplish a great deal power-wise with these. But anything outside of OEM naturally aspirated, if you got into high flow stuff or boost, then the plastic kind of has to go. So they haven't been readily adapted, but it's still a relatively new motor, being anywhere from 12 to 10 years old currently. So this is comparisons between the RBC and RRC. There was a little bit in here. I'd like to update this with better pictures without all the extras. Comparisons of the RBC versus RBB on the left. Could probably enlarge those pictures a little bit and update that. I may do that before I publish this. And then the RBB versus RAA. You'll see this is the RBB TSX intake manifold. The lower portion with throttle body, you'll see how large the runners are, how large the plenum is in comparison. This builds torque, has torque on demand. This builds a little bit higher velocity air, and that's why some of those resonant chambers are necessary. And then the velocity equates to better fuel atomization. A few examples of the intake manifold, exhaust manifold groups. So just for reference. And then the K24Z7, the integrated exhaust port design, which you can see why Honda adapted this just on an engineering aspect or assembly aspect. You have 4 bolts to put in instead of 7, more easily manufactured, less manufacturing time in the head, on the exhaust ports at least, less manufacturing time on the exhaust manifold. Again, you can improve it a great deal, but you can easily adapt a turbo manifold to this. This was a table that was picked up. It probably needs a good update, but this was the gearing for all of the transmissions up to, I want to say, 2007. So you can walk through. Nope. It goes up to 08. It goes through, identifies gear ratios, whether it has limited slip. I don't know if these have the all-wheel drive included in here. So, but again, identifiers, what engine it came with, the transmission codes. You're pretty much limited to whatever swap information, again, you have for getting that engine into your car. You're kind of left to the aftermarket mount suppliers for which transmission you have. Each one of the transmissions has an identification label, or should have an identification label. If you don't, then it's easier to pick out the early generations of the RSX transmissions versus the later generations in general. You'll hear me say high frequency speed signal. It comes off the counter shaft, and it's a sensor down here. The RSX had that transitional period in it. Later transmissions only operate off the counter shaft for the high frequency speed sensor. You'll notice down here it doesn't have the high frequency speed sensor. It does have a reverse lockout on this transmission, and it does have the same mounting locations as well. It helps to confirm what transmission is coming out of which car with the identification label. That being said, this is why. This is the 13 to 15 ILX transmission. The bolt pattern for the transmission side is completely different. You could not bolt an RS6 mount up to this. So it's good to have that relationship with your mount provider. Hopefully you use a quality mount provider that has good information across the board. They can provide you with what you need and build a set of mounts that will adapt your chassis to the components that you have. Shifter identification. It's getting more and more prevalent that aftermarket shifter providers like Hybrid Racing are building these shifters to suit the transmission. This was part of the old guide that I really used as a base from X Productions, but still relevant to this day. You'll see small variance between these, and you'll notice that, especially between just what's available for the Civic and RSX that's interchangeable, there's a wide variety and difference between them. So the TSX shifter is the one that's probably the most prevalent because it does function completely differently than the RSX and the Civics with the D17. It's just not interchangeable unless you swap over to the TSX cables and the TSX shifter mechanism on top of the transmission. The RSX base, RSX Type S, Civic for the D17, and the Revo are pretty much across the board interchangeable. Same geometry, same cable. One operates better than the other. The Revo has it's a great option for an economical aftermarket shifter. I think they're about $120 shipped to the door. They may even be as low as $80, $90. But it beats spending $350 from one of the big brands that have quality shifters. Here I went and outlined the difference between the shift cables. A lot of people end up buying EP3 SI shifter cables on accident. And it sucks. It does. Because they don't work with a Type S shifter inside your 96 Civic, or with the Type S shifter in your 94 Accord. It just doesn't work. The connections are different. The throw is different. The shifter mechanism for the EP3 is completely different just because of the shifter location being on the dash versus on the floor. But this should help with the lengths, identifications, overall with finding a quality set of cables. And the sneakiest set is the DM2D17 cables. They're about 3 inches, 4 inches shorter. I originally had them laying side by side when I did my swap because my car was manual, and it blew my mind that they were that close, and I'm surprised more people didn't have that problem. Hopefully this guide helps to solve a lot of those issues. I will provide a link for this to download this guide for other downloads, and I'll end up posting it in a couple forums pages, and as well as hopefully getting it in some Facebook groups for people that purchase parts readily. But hopefully these references and resources do you a great deal of good when purchasing any kind of parts used or new. And